I'm at a bucket list location for every historian, and I'm super excited to share it with you. Join me today from the McLean house, where in the parlor General Lee and General Grant will meet for terms of the surrender of the Civil War on Walk with History from Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. I'm Jen, a Walk with History, veteran, museum professional, historian, and I'm here at a bucket list location for every historian, the city of Appomattox Courthouse, where the McLean house is, where the actual surrender took place. Most people don't realize that Appomattox Courthouse is the name of the city. It's not a location, although it is a location. This is the actual Appomattox Courthouse. You would say it as the Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox Courthouse. Virginia, the way it works is when counties are set up and courthouses are set up, a lot of times that city will be called that courthouse. And that's what happens here in Appomattox. This is along the stage line here, Lynchburg stage line. And this is the city of Clover Hill. But once the Appomattox Courthouse is built, it becomes the Appomattox Courthouse village, city. And the McLean set up their home here after they leave, after the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. They leave to set up a home here. And unfortunately, that is the home that's going to be picked out and used for the surrender between Lee and Grant in April of 1865. But most people, when they hear Appomattox Courthouse, don't realize it's two separate locations. Appomattox Courthouse, McLean house, and then it's a whole village. About 100 people lived here. And farming location, enslavement, about half the people who lived here are enslaved. It's a farming community, so of course you're going to have enslavement in a farming community. And along the railroad line, which just makes this place significant because this is where the Confederates were trying to bring in supplies and reinforce troops, and they're cut off by the Union. And this is where Lee can see his 30,000 Confederates against the 70,000 Union troops. He could either keep fighting and it become a bloodbath, or he can surrender and save lives. And he takes it upon himself, even though he'd rather die 1,000 deaths, he takes it upon himself to negotiate those terms of surrender because he wants to save lives and he wants people to come back into the Union and live, and it to be as easy and seamless as possible, although it is still going to be very difficult. He doesn't want it to be this prolonged bloodshed for even more years than it's already been. This is what they consider the best depiction of the surrender. You get the Union over here, Lee over here, you get Custer right there, Robert Todd Lincoln, Grant, Sheridan, Marshall, so you get Lee and Marshall. Sherman is right here. This is supposed to be Custer here, and then this is Parker here, Eli Parker. Custer is not really present at the surrender, but he's here kind of ceremoniously. This is more accurate, this one. Because here you got Robert Todd Lincoln, who's actually here. Here you get Parker. Here you get Marshall, here you get Lee. Here's the table of surrender. On this table, officers from both sides place the terms of surrender. If this is the table of surrender, more than likely this was Custer's wife's, because this is what Custer took. And then she's going to will it back to the people after she passes away. So the flag and the table get willed back. Okay, so I'm going to walk over to the McLean house. So remember, Appomattox Courthouse is the name of the town. The surrender takes place at Wilbur McLean's house. And you'll remember Wilbur McLean because we've talked about him in the First Battle of Bull Run, where he lived in Manassas. And we went to his grave at the Alexandria Cemetery in Virginia. So Wilbur McLean couldn't seem to get away from the Civil War. Now this house was taken apart in the 1890s. They wanted to move it to Washington, D.C. and use it as kind of a visitor place so people could come see where the surrender of the Civil War took place. But then it sat here as wood and bricks for about 50 years and it was never moved. And then it was just rebuilt with the specifications they had at the time. And it opened to the public in 1949. So this is the room where it happened. I'm in the room where it happened. Lee sits here, Grant sits here, his men are behind him. Lee is here for about 30 minutes before Grant arrives in his best. This is Wilbur McLean's furniture. And Custer, who is here with Grant, will start to purchase this furniture. And as you remember, I showed you the chairs in the Smithsonian today. The table, I think, is in Chicago Museum, but every piece of this furniture is basically commandeered by Union soldiers. Poor Wilbur McLean. But again, Grant will sit here for about 30 minutes. He arrives here at 1 o'clock on April 9th and waits for Grant to arrive. Grant gets here about 1:30 and they work out the terms of surrender for about an hour and a half. It's about 3 o'clock that they will leave this living room together. So let's talk a little bit about the Wilbur McLean house here. This house is built in 1848. Wilbur McLean will buy it in 1863. It's kind of built as a tavern. McLean will leave here after the surrender takes place. His house has basically been gutted of furniture because everyone's taken it as a memento or paid him for it. He wants again to get away from the war. He also has a lot of money in the Confederacy. So his money is basically within a day worth nothing. And so he doesn't have the lucrative financial backing that he had before the war. So he goes back to Alexandria, Virginia. And this house will go into foreclosure. And then it's actually owned by a couple people throughout time. And then in the 1890s, you're gonna get a couple of financiers come together and wanna move this house to Washington, D.C. as kind of a tourist attraction. So they take it all down, they take all the bricks apart, they measure everything, they get all the plans, and they leave it to be moved, but then the financing falls through. And for 50 years, it sits there as bricks and wood, and people come and take it as souvenirs, a brick or a piece of wood, and then the National Park Service will buy it in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and start to rebuild it. It takes about 10 years from 1941 to 1949 because of World War II and financing, but in 1949 it's going to open for the National Park Service. Behind the McLean house, you'll get the summer kitchen. Just like in colonial Williamsburg, kitchens are not attached to the house. Fire, workers, things along that nature, the space. And then you have enslaved quarters here as well. So make no mistake, we're in Virginia and we're in farm country, and you're going to have enslavement anywhere farm country is. So the McLeans are enslavers, and of the 100 people that live here in the city of Appomattox Courthouse, about half of them are enslaved. So can you just imagine, April 9th, 1 o'clock, Lee comes here dressed in his clean white officer uniform, walks up these steps, walks through the front door, and goes immediately to the left and sits and waits for Grant to join him here. Now Grant arrives in a muddy uniform that really the only thing that shows he's a general is the epaulets that are on his overcoat. And he comes in and sits down, and he's so in awe of Lee that he makes small talk to begin with. He doesn't even talk about surrender. It's Lee that has to bring them back to, okay, let's talk about terms of surrender. And so they sit down and they start to hash it out. And Grant had met earlier with Lincoln and had talked about how do we bring people back into the Union? How do we end this bloodshed? And Lincoln wanted nobody to be executed or held accountable. That's why you get Davis, who's not going to be executed for treason, Lee, everybody's going to be able to return home without malice and go back to their lives as long as they don't take up arms again against the Union. They meet here for about an hour and a half. What's very interesting is one of the colonels that's going to write the form of surrender is from the Seneca American Indian tribe. And Lee will say to him, "It's great that we have a true American here." And he will respond to Lee and say, "Sir, we are all Americans." The biggest terms of surrender is to reunite without malice. And so really all Grant asks is for the Confederates to pledge to not take up arms against the United States. And that's why it's going to be very symbolic when they retreat and they surrender and they walk away, that they leave all their rifles and arms for the Union Army. But Lee had known that most of these men going home have their own horses. And also it's going to, a lot of them are farmers and they have land, and they're going to need those horses to make a way of life for themselves. So he asks that his men be able to keep their horses, and he asks if his men will be able to keep their sidearms with them. And Grant allows that. He allows them to keep their sidearms, and then any man who owns a horse, they're allowed to take that with them. And that's the generous terms of surrender, and begins the reunification. So you have 68,000 Union troops, about 28,000 Confederate troops. And to get all these Confederate men taking with them the news of surrender and the reunification, they start to print out, over in this home over here, parole slips. And the printing presses set up in Clover Hill Tavern quickly produce passes or paroles for Confederates en route to their home. They print 30,000 blank parole forms, and that's those forms are be able to travel again within the area and go back to their homes. Of Appomattox Courthouse where the surrender would have taken place. So can you imagine 80,000 troops here? You've got 60,000 Union troops and 30,000 Confederate troops, so no, almost 90,000 troops camped out. and waiting. And in this spot, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant and General Lee met on the morning of April 10th, and they're negotiating the final terms of surrender. So being here at Appomattox Courthouse, like I said, is a huge bucket list thing for any historian. To come to the place where Lee and Grant worked out the surrender of the Civil War was just amazing and awesome and super cool. You get to see the whole context of it all, the little town of Appomattox Courthouse, how everything kind of played out, and you can imagine all the players here and what they did. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank you for being here. And if you ever get a chance to make it out here, let me know what you think. And on to my next Walk with History.